Have you ever noticed how the same people who once celebrated you can turn cold the moment your growth outshines their comfort? There's a peculiar phenomenon that occurs in human relationships, one that the great mystic Ibn Arabi observed centuries ago. He spoke of a truth so uncomfortable that most refuse to acknowledge it. People love you until your light becomes too bright for their eyes. This isn't about arrogance or superiority. It's about something far more unsettling, something that lies dormant in the human psyche until triggered by the unbearable sight of someone else's transformation. What Ibn Arabi understood, and what modern psychology has only begun to uncover, is that hatred doesn't always announce itself with obvious hostility. Sometimes it wears the mask of love, friendship, even admiration. It hides behind smiles and supportive words, waiting for the precise moment when your evolution threatens the carefully constructed illusions others have built about themselves. This veiled hatred isn't born from malice in its purest form. It emerges from something more primal, more human, and infinitely more tragic. Consider the nature of light itself. Light doesn't discriminate. It simply shines, illuminating everything in its path without judgment or intention. Yet when light enters a dark room, it exposes what was hidden. Dust particles dancing in the air, stains on the walls, the disorder that darkness mercifully concealed. The light itself is neutral, but its revelation can be unbearable for those who've grown comfortable in shadows. Ibn Arabi saw this dynamic playing out not just in physical spaces, but in the realm of human consciousness and relationships. When you begin to transform, when you start embodying a higher version of yourself, you become that light. Your growth, your clarity, your newfound peace, it all serves as an uncomfortable mirror, reflecting back what others have been avoiding in themselves. The tragedy is that they loved you before, genuinely loved you, when you were struggling alongside them in the darkness. Your shared suffering created a bond, an unspoken agreement that you were both navigating the same limited reality. But the moment you found a way out, the moment your light began to shine, that agreement was broken. This is where the veil becomes essential to understanding human behavior. The hatred that emerges isn't consciously chosen. Most people would be horrified to discover they harbor resentment towards someone they claim to love. They rationalize their feelings, disguise them as concern, frame them as constructive criticism. They tell themselves they're trying to protect you from becoming arrogant, from losing your humility, from forgetting where you came from. But beneath these noble justifications lies something else entirely, something they cannot face without dismantling their entire self-concept. Ibn Arabi spoke of the nafs, the ego self that constantly seeks validation through comparison. The nafs doesn't exist in isolation. It measures itself against others, finding security in sameness and threat in difference. When someone in your circle begins to transcend the collective mediocrity, when they start operating from a different level of consciousness, the nafs interprets this as a personal attack. Your light doesn't just illuminate your own path forward, it exposes the fact that others have been standing still, perhaps even moving backward. The psychology behind this phenomenon is fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. Humans are tribal creatures, wired for belonging. Throughout our evolutionary history, being cast out from the group meant certain death. So we developed sophisticated mechanisms to maintain cohesion, to ensure everyone conformed to the group's norms and limitations. Anyone who deviated too far from the median was seen as a threat to the tribe's stability. This ancient programming still runs in the background of our modern minds, creating reactions that seem irrational when examined in the light of conscious awareness. When you evolve beyond the group's comfort zone, something primal activates in those around you. They experience what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort of holding two contradictory beliefs simultaneously. On one hand, they love you and want the best for you. On the other hand, your transformation threatens their worldview and sense of self. The mind cannot tolerate this contradiction for long. It must resolve the tension, and the easiest path is to reframe your growth as something negative. Suddenly, your confidence becomes arrogance. Your peace becomes aloofness. Your boundaries become selfishness. Your success becomes luck or manipulation. The narrative shifts, and you find yourself being subtly punished for the very qualities that once would have been celebrated had they remained theoretical rather than actual. This is the veil Ibn Arabi spoke of, the unconscious mechanism that allows people to hate what they claim to love while maintaining a clear conscience. The most painful aspect of this dynamic is its invisibility to those perpetrating it. They genuinely believe they're acting from a place of love and concern. When they undermine your achievements, they frame it as keeping you grounded. When they question your choices, they present it as caring guidance. When they distance themselves from you, they justify it as you having changed, as you no longer being the person they knew. And perhaps they're right about that last part. You're not the same person. But the question becomes, why is your evolution their problem? Ibn Arabi's mystical insights align remarkably with modern attachment theory and the psychology of projection. What we cannot accept in ourselves, we project onto others. If someone has resigned themselves to a life of limitation, if they've made peace with their own stagnation, your growth becomes an unbearable reminder of the choices they failed to make. Your light doesn't blind them because it's too bright in any objective sense. It blinds them because they've conditioned their eyes to darkness, and any illumination feels like an assault. This explains why the same action can be received completely differently depending on who performs it. If someone within the accepted range of the group's collective limitation achieves something, they're celebrated. But if you, having pushed beyond those invisible boundaries, achieve something far greater, you're met with suspicion, skepticism, even hostility. The achievement itself isn't the issue. The threat you represent to the group's consensus reality is what triggers the veiled hatred. Think about the mechanics of envy, that corrosive emotion that masquerades as so many other things. Envy isn't simply wanting what someone else has. That's desire, and desire can be motivating, even healthy. Envy is the specific wish that the other person didn't have what they have, that their success would diminish or disappear. It's a destructive rather than constructive impulse, and it thrives in the gap between where someone is and where they believe they should be, especially when another person's presence makes that gap impossible to ignore. Your light makes that gap visible. Before your transformation, everyone could maintain comfortable delusions about their potential. They could tell themselves that if they really wanted to, if circumstances were different, if they had the time or resources or support, they too could achieve great things. Your actual achievement, your lived transformation, demolishes these comforting lies. You had many of the same starting conditions, faced similar obstacles, dealt with comparable challenges, yet you found a way through while they found reasons why they couldn't. This is where the hatred takes root, in the soil of undeniable truth. They loved you when you validated their limitations, when your struggles confirmed that the path was indeed too difficult for anyone to walk. But your success invalidates their excuses, and people protect their excuses more fiercely than they pursue their dreams. The excuse is what allows them to maintain their self-image as someone with potential, while simultaneously avoiding the terror and discomfort of actually pursuing that potential. Ibn Arabi understood that spiritual development, psychological growth, any form of genuine transformation is ultimately a solitary journey. You may have companions for stretches of the path, but there will come moments when you must walk alone, when your next step forward requires leaving behind those who cannot or will not follow. This isn't about superiority or abandonment. It's about recognizing that not everyone is called to the same level of awakening, and that's acceptable. What's not acceptable is allowing others' limitations to become your ceiling. The veiled hatred emerges most intensely from those closest to you, the ones who knew you before your transformation. Strangers can accept you as you are because they have no investment in who you used to be. But family, old friends, long-time colleagues, they have a version of you frozen in their minds, a version that served a specific function in their psychological ecosystem. When you outgrow that version, when you shatter their image of who you're supposed to be, they experience a kind of loss, and loss often manifests as anger directed at whoever or whatever caused the change. Consider the parable of the cave that Plato offered, another philosopher who understood this dynamic. The prisoners in the cave, seeing only shadows on the wall, believe those shadows constitute the entirety of reality. When one prisoner breaks free and sees the sun, the true source of light, and returns to tell the others, they don't believe him. In some versions of the story, they want to kill him for disturbing their comfortable ignorance. His light, his knowledge, threatens the stability of their shared delusion. This is what you face when you transform. You become the escaped prisoner returning with news of a reality beyond the cave. But those still chained don't want to hear it. They've organized their entire existence around the shadows. Your insistence that there's something more, something better, something true, feels like an attack on everything they've built their identity upon. So they attack back. Not with open violence usually, but with the subtle cruelty of dismissal, mockery, abandonment. The psychological term for this is the tall poppy syndrome, the cultural phenomenon where people of high status or achievement are resented, attacked, or criticized because their success elevates them above their peers. The metaphor comes from the practice of cutting down the tallest poppies in a field to maintain uniformity. It's a deeply ingrained social mechanism designed to enforce conformity and prevent individuals from standing out too much from the collective. What Ibn Arabi added to this understanding is the spiritual dimension. He recognized that this isn't merely a social or psychological phenomenon, it's a test, a necessary stage in the journey of awakening. The veiled hatred you encounter serves a purpose. It reveals who is genuinely capable of loving you unconditionally versus who loved only the version of you that made them comfortable. It strips away false relationships, leaving only those connections strong enough to withstand your evolution. In this sense, your light becomes a filter. It doesn't blind everyone, only those whose eyes are closed. Those who are secure in themselves, who have done their own inner work, can celebrate your growth without feeling diminished by it. They understand that your success doesn't subtract from their potential. In fact, they're inspired by it, seeing in your transformation proof that change is possible. These are the people who remain after the veiled hatred has driven others away. But we must be careful here not to fall into spiritual arrogance, another trap Ibn Arabi warned against. Recognizing that others may harbor veiled hatred toward your growth doesn't make you superior to them. It makes you human, flawed, still learning. The same mechanisms that cause others to resent your light exist within you, ready to activate when someone else's brilliance triggers your insecurities. The difference is in consciousness, in catching yourself before the veil fully descends, in choosing to transmute envy into inspiration. This requires brutal self-honesty, the kind that Ibn Arabi practiced and taught. You must ask yourself uncomfortable questions. Have there been times when someone else's success made you feel inadequate? Have you ever disguised resentment as concern? Have you subtly undermined someone because their growth highlighted your stagnation? If you can't answer yes to these questions, you're likely not being honest with yourself. The veiled hatred isn't something only others experience. It's a universal human tendency that requires constant vigilance to overcome. The path forward, then, isn't to judge those who cannot handle your light. Judgment only creates more veils, more separation, more unconsciousness. Instead, Ibn Arabi suggests compassion rooted in understanding. They're not bad people for struggling with your transformation. They're hurt people, scared people, people trapped in their own darkness who genuinely cannot yet see what you see. Their hatred, veiled as it may be, is ultimately directed at themselves, at their own unrealized potential. You're simply the mirror making that failure visible. This compassion doesn't mean subjecting yourself to their toxicity. Boundaries are essential. You can love someone from a distance. You can wish them well while removing them from your daily life. You can recognize their pain without allowing it to dim your light. This is the balance Ibn Arabi walked, seeing the divine in everyone while not allowing their unconsciousness to derail his path. He loved humanity deeply, while maintaining clear discernment about who could walk beside him. There's a particular loneliness that comes with this understanding. Once you see the veiled hatred, once you recognize the patterns, you can't unsee them. You start noticing the subtle ways people try to bring you down to their level, the backhanded compliments, the unsolicited advice designed to create doubt, the convenient silence when you share good news, the sudden unavailability when you need support, the gossip that makes its way back to you. All of it stems from that same source. Your light has become too bright for their comfort. But here's what Ibn Arabi knew that makes this bearable. Your light isn't really yours. You're not the source of the illumination. You're simply less obstructed than you used to be, allowing more of the universal light to shine through. This isn't about personal achievement or individual superiority. It's about transparency, about removing the barriers between your surface self and your deeper nature. When you understand this, The veiled hatred others direct at you becomes less personal, less painful. They're not really reacting to you. They're reacting to the light itself, to the possibility of transformation that your presence represents. And on some level, beneath all the psychological defenses and unconscious mechanisms, they're angry at themselves for not choosing what you chose, for not doing what you did, for not becoming what you could have become. Their hatred is grief in disguise, mourning for the life they might have lived if only they'd had the courage to step into their own light. This realization can transform your relationship with the phenomenon. Instead of feeling wounded by their rejection, you can feel a deep sadness for what they're missing, for the prison they're choosing to remain in. You can recognize that their attacks, subtle or overt, aren't really about you at all. You're simply the screen onto which they project their internal struggle. And while that doesn't make their behavior acceptable, it makes it comprehensible. And comprehension is the first step toward forgiveness. Forgiveness in this context isn't about condoning harmful behavior or maintaining toxic relationships. It's about releasing the resentment that would otherwise weigh you down, about refusing to let their inability to handle your light convince you to dim it. Ibn Arabi taught that forgiveness is ultimately for the forgiver, a way of freeing yourself from the chains of others' unconsciousness. When you forgive, you reclaim your energy from the past and redirect it toward your continued evolution. The question becomes not whether others can handle your light, but whether you're willing to keep shining despite their discomfort. This is where many people falter. The pain of rejection, the loneliness of being misunderstood, the exhaustion of constantly defending your choices, it all accumulates, and the temptation arises to dim your light just enough to fit back in, to be loved again by those who abandoned you, to restore the comfort of belonging even if it means sacrificing your growth. Ibn Arabi would say this is the crucial test. Will you trade your truth for their approval? Will you betray your transformation to maintain relationships that were conditional all along? Will you let their veiled hatred convince you that there's something wrong with your light, rather than something unhealed in their darkness? These aren't easy questions, and there's no judgment for those who choose the path of dimming. It's a profoundly human response to a deeply painful situation. But for those who choose to keep shining, who decide that their evolution is non-negotiable regardless of who it costs them, there's a different kind of reward. Not the external validation they once craved, not the approval of those who can't see them anyway, but something more substantial, a kind of internal alignment or integrity between who they are and who they appear to be, an authenticity that makes life simultaneously harder and infinitely more meaningful. This path requires accepting that you may be misunderstood, that your intentions may be distorted, that your character may be questioned by people who once knew you or thought they did. It requires developing a kind of psychological immunity to others' projections, an ability to remain centered in your own truth even when everyone around you insists you've changed for the worse. It requires trusting your inner compass more than the crowd's consensus. Ibn Arabi called this walking the edge of the sword, a metaphor for the narrow path between extremes. You can't become callous and dismiss everyone who struggles with your growth. That would be falling into arrogance. But you also can't shrink yourself to accommodate everyone's limitations. That would be betraying your soul. The middle way requires discernment, compassion, strength, and flexibility all at once. It's not a path for the faint of heart. What makes it bearable is remembering that this isn't permanent. The veiled hatred you encounter today may transform tomorrow. Some of the people who can't handle your light now might do their own work, face their own shadows, and eventually be able to see you clearly again. Not everyone who leaves your life is gone forever. Some are simply on a different timeline, and your paths may intersect again when you're both at different stages of development. This hope isn't about waiting for others to catch up so you can feel whole again. It's about recognizing that consciousness evolves, that people can change, that today's limitations aren't necessarily permanent. You don't dim your light waiting for them. You continue forward, trusting that those meant to be in your life will find their way back when the time is right, and those who aren't will fade into the background of memory. Meanwhile, you focus on what you can control, your own continued evolution, your response to others' reactions, your commitment to authentic expression regardless of the cost. You surround yourself with those rare individuals who can handle your light, who are inspired rather than threatened by your growth. You build new connections based on who you are now rather than who you used to be. You create a life that reflects your current truth rather than your historical identity. And perhaps most importantly, you do the inner work necessary to ensure you're not perpetrating the same veiled hatred toward others that you've experienced. You catch yourself when envy arises. You transmute comparison into inspiration. You celebrate others' successes genuinely. You refuse to let your wounds become someone else's cage. You break the cycle by being for others what you needed when you were transforming. Someone who could witness and celebrate growth without feeling diminished by it. This is how the pattern shifts, one person at a time, choosing consciousness over unconsciousness, love over fear, evolution over stagnation. Ibn Arabi's teaching about veiled hatred wasn't meant to make us cynical or defensive. It was meant to make us aware, to help us understand the dynamics at play so we could navigate them with wisdom rather than naivety. When you know what you're dealing with, you can respond skillfully instead of reacting blindly. The veiled hatred will come. It's not a matter of if but when. Your light will eventually become bright enough to trigger someone's darkness. The question is whether you'll be prepared, whether you'll understand what's happening, whether you'll have the strength to keep shining anyway, and whether, in that moment of recognition, you'll choose compassion over bitterness, understanding over resentment, continued growth over comfortable stagnation. Because here's the deeper truth Ibn Arabi understood. The hatred isn't really veiled to protect you from seeing it. It's veiled to protect them from seeing themselves. The mask they wear when they turn against your light isn't for your benefit. It's their last defense against confronting their own choices, their own limitations, their own unexpressed potential. When they attack your transformation, they're really fighting the internal battle they haven't had the courage to face. And knowing this changes everything. It transforms the experience from personal rejection to witnessing someone else's struggle with themselves. It doesn't make it painless, but it makes it comprehensible. It doesn't eliminate the loneliness, but it contextualizes it. It doesn't prevent the loss of relationships, but it helps you understand that those relationships were built on a foundation of shared limitation, and your growth simply exposed what was always true. So you keep walking, you keep evolving. You keep allowing your light to shine, not because you're trying to blind anyone, but because dimming it would be a betrayal of everything you've worked to become. You accept that some will turn away, that some will attack, that some will love you only in your absence or in memory of who you used to be. And you make peace with being misunderstood, because being truly seen was never about being seen by everyone, only by those with eyes open enough to handle the light. This is Ibn Arabi's gift, the hard wisdom that sets you free. The veiled hatred isn't something to fear or fight. It's something to understand, to expect, to navigate with as much grace and consciousness as you can muster. It's part of the price of transformation, and whether that price is worth paying is a question only you can answer. But know this: on the other side of that hatred, veiled or otherwise, lies a version of yourself you never imagined possible, a life more authentic than you knew existed, and connections with others deep enough to withstand any amount of light you could possibly shine.